It's gone again.
You're still here. That's what matters.
The smoke still clung to the stones when Clara Whitfield stepped off the wagon. Montana Territory autumn of 1879. The air sharp with pine and loss. Where a home should have stood, only black ribs of timber jutted against the gray sky. The letter in her hand creased, dirt-stained, signed, "Yours faithfully, Thomas Hale," meant nothing now. Whoever he was, he'd burned away with the rest. She dropped her trunk in the ash, the latch snapping open to spill ribbons, a wedding bonnet, and a tin cross her mother once pressed to her palm. A wind rose off the ridge, lifting soot like snow. No sound but her breath, the whisper of ruin. Then came hoofbeats, slow, deliberate. A man in a dust-streaked coat reined in at the fence line, eyes unreadable beneath the brim. He looked once at the wreckage, then at her. "You're late," he said quietly. "He's gone. But this land still needs keeping." The smoke still clung to the stones when Clara Whitfield stepped off the wagon. Montana Territory, autumn of 1879, the air sharp with pine and loss. Where a home should have stood, only black ribs of timber jutted against the gray sky. The letter in her hand creased, dirt-stained, signed, "Yours faithfully, Thomas Hale," meant nothing now. Whoever he was, he'd burned away with the rest. The driver muttered an apology, eyes averted, as though tragedy might be contagious. He flicked the reins and left her in the ash without a word. Dust from his wheels folded back into the smoke, swallowing sound and company alike. For a long moment she didn't move. The scorched clearing felt hollowed by more than fire. It seemed the land itself had exhaled and not yet drawn breath again. She knelt, pressed gloved fingers to the earth warm still beneath the gray crust, and wondered if grief had a temperature. Her bonnet string snapped in the wind. Bits of soot clung to her lashes like tears. She had traveled 14 days by rail and 3 by wagon to become a wife. Instead, she stood a widow to a life that had never begun. A low sound came from the edge of the property, a single hoof striking rock. She turned, startled. The man sat his horse as if grown there, lean-framed, dust-caked, hat shadowing his eyes. He didn't speak at once, just took in the ruin, then the woman standing amid it. "You're late," he said quietly. His voice held the rough calm of someone who'd spoken little lately. She blinked at him, unsure if she'd heard right. "Late?" He dismounted, boots crunching on cinders. "Thomas Hale died 6 weeks ago. Fire took the cabin. Then fever took him. I buried him yonder." He nodded toward a small rise behind the blackened corral, where a rough wooden cross leaned against the wind. Clara's throat tightened. "You knew him?" "I worked beside him. Helped run his herd through the dry summer." The man's gaze flicked to her trunk half spilled in the dirt. "He wrote you, didn't he? Said he needed a wife." Her fingers closed around the ruined letter. "He did." The man nodded once. "Then you came farther than he ever expected you to." Quote. He looked down, scuffing the ash with his boot. "Name's Elias Mercer. I keep the North Range now. You shouldn't stay here tonight." Clara looked around at the emptiness. "There's nowhere else." "There's always somewhere," he said, though his eyes softened at the sight of her shaking hands. "River shack's still standing. 1/2 mile. Come morning, you can decide what to do." "I won't run," she said quietly. "This was meant to be my home." "Home's gone," he answered, "but the land's still here. If you stay different." Something in his tone, neither command nor comfort, unlocked the last of her strength. She nodded. Elias lifted her trunk easily to the back of his horse and motioned for her to follow on foot. The path wound through blackened pines, their needles turned to soot. Every gust made them whisper, like paper being torn. Clara kept pace, skirts catching on charred roots, breath misting in the cooling air. At the creek hollow, a single cabin remained intact, walls smoke-streaked but upright. The smell of wet timber hung thick. Elias pushed open the door with the back of his glove. Inside, the hearth was cold, but a stack of split logs waited near it. "You'll have warmth soon," he said, striking flint to steel. Sparks flared, caught. Within minutes the flame found life, licking orange against the gloom. The light revealed more of him. A man past 30, perhaps, with sun-creased skin and a mouth that looked unaccustomed to smiling. His left sleeve was torn, revealing a scar that wrapped his forearm like a pale rope. Clara eased onto a stool by the fire. "Was this yours?" "Belonged to Hale's partner before me. Been empty a year." "Then why help me?" she asked, voice low. Elias fed another stick into the fire. "Because he wrote you a promise, and promises ought to be answered one way or another." Outside, night gathered in the trees. Wind moaned through the gaps in the chinking. Clara shivered, and Elias wordlessly handed her a wool blanket from his saddle roll. She wrapped it around herself, breathing in the faint scent of horse and rain. "You've got a place to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "No family left. Boston's behind me." "Then Montana's all you've got." "I suppose so." Quote. He nodded once, as if confirming a fact of weather. "There's stew if you're hungry." From his pack he drew a small tin, poured its contents into a pot, added water. The smells, salt and pepper and something wild, filled the small room. While it simmered, Clara traced the grain of the table with her fingers. "Did he suffer?" she asked suddenly. Elias's ladle paused mid-stir. "Not long. Fever took him gentle." She exhaled, a thin, trembling sound. "He wrote such kind words. Said he'd built a porch facing the sunrise so I could read my letters there." Elias glanced toward the burned valley. "He meant to. Guess the sunrise got there first." They ate in silence after that, metal spoons tapping softly against tin. When she finished, she murmured a thank you. He nodded but said nothing, settling near the door, rifle across his knees. "You're keeping watch?" "Wolves been restless since the fire. They come sniffing at what's gone. And—" She studied the rigid line of his shoulders, the way the firelight carved his profile into bronze and shadow. "You've done this before," she said. "Done what?" "Guarded strangers." He looked toward her then, expression unreadable. "Out here, nobody stays a stranger long. World's too wide for that." The fire crackled, shrinking to embers. Clara drifted between waking and sleep, the day's exhaustion pressing her down. Through half-closed eyes, she saw Elias sit motionless, head tilted as though listening to something only the night could tell. When she woke, dawn seeped through the cracks, pale and chill. The fire had died, but the man was still there, back against the wall, hat over his eyes, rifle laid beside him. He hadn't slept. She rose quietly, pulling her shawl tight. Outside, frost silvered the grass where the ash ended. The mountains beyond glowed pink with sunrise. She walked a few steps toward the ruin of her intended home. From this distance, it looked almost peaceful. The black timbers, outlined against gold light. A skeleton, given beauty by the dawn. Among the wreckage she found a half-melted hinge, the remains of a kettle, a shard of mirror catching sky. She pocketed it carefully. A reflection was still a reflection, even broken. When she turned back, Elias was saddling his horse. "Thought you'd gone," she said. He tightened the cinch. "You wouldn't make it a mile alone out here. I'll see you through until you've got a roof again. I can manage." His look said otherwise, though he only replied, "Maybe, but you don't have to yet." They spent the morning clearing what could be salvaged. Clara found a crate of nails untouched by flame, some rusted tools, and a charred Bible whose pages clung together like leaves after rain. She wiped its cover clean, traced the faint gold letters. Elias worked beside her without instruction, stacking usable boards, riding a half-burned water barrel. His silence wasn't the cold kind. It was the steady rhythm of someone who knew talk didn't move stone. By noon, her palms were blistered, her dress smeared with soot. Elias built a small lean-to from what they'd gathered. "It'll keep rain off for now," he said. "Why bother?" she asked, weary. "Everything's ruined." He looked at the ground, then at her. "Because starting again's the only thing the West ever promises." The words settled in her like an ember refusing to die. They worked until dusk. When they returned to the creek cabin, Clara's limbs trembled from exhaustion. Elias started the fire again, this time letting her strike the flint. She managed on the third try. He gave a single approving nod. "You learn quick," he said. "I had a good teacher." That drew the ghost of a smile from him, brief, but real. As they ate, rain began tapping on the roof. A slow, steady rhythm. Clara listened to it, head tilted. "I used to love storms," she said. "In the city, they sounded far away, safe. Here it feels like the sky's right over you." "It is," Elias said. "Nothing between you and whatever's coming. You don't sound afraid." "I'm not," he replied simply. "Fear's what keeps most folks alive out here. I've had my share, ran out of it one winter, and learned to live quiet instead." Quote. She watched him, the flicker of fire catching the scar on his arm again. "What happened that winter?" He poked the fire with a stick. "Lost people. Happens to everyone sooner or later." Clara nodded slowly. "Then you understand." "Understand what?" "Why I'm not leaving. You can lose everything in a night and still be alive in the morning. That must mean something." Elias regarded her for a long time. "Maybe it means you're meant to stay." Days folded into one another. They repaired the well, mended the barn roof, dug out a root cellar that had only half collapsed. The rhythm of work dulled grief into motion. At first, Elias spoke little, offering instructions with gestures rather than words. But gradually, his silences changed flavor from guarded to companionable. When he found her humming as she scrubbed smoke stains from a salvaged chair, he paused outside the doorway, listening, then said, "Keep that up, and the wolves'll think this place is alive again." Quote. She smiled. Maybe that's the point. Sometimes he rode out at dawn, returning at dusk with sacks of grain from a neighboring ranch. Other times he repaired fences, hands deft with wire and knot. Each evening he brought her something small. A clean kerchief, a tin mug, once even a single book, its pages water-stained but readable. "Found it at the trading post," he said. "Figured you might miss words." The title read, "The Pilgrim's Progress." She opened it that night by lamplight, the corners of her mouth softening at the first line. "As I walked through the wilderness of this world." She read aloud until the lamp sputtered out, and from his bunk by the door, Elias murmured, half asleep, "Sounds like you." Winter edged closer. Nights grew brittle. Mornings rhymed with ice. Clara learned to chop wood, to mend torn gloves with sinew thread. Once, while splitting kindling, she caught her hand on the axe blade. Blood welled bright against pale skin. Elias was beside her before she could hide it. "Let me see." He took her hand, his touch firm but gentle. He cleaned the cut with whiskey, wrapped it with a strip torn from his own sleeve. "You didn't have to." "I did," he said. "Bleeding never stays small out here." For the first time, she met his gaze long enough to see past the quiet. There was kindness there, tempered by solitude, like sunlight filtered through smoke. "Thank you," she said. He released her hand slowly. "You're doing fine, Mrs. Whitfield." "Miss," she corrected softly. "Still, Miss Whitfield." He inclined his head. "Then, Miss Whitfield, you're tougher than most men I've known." One night near the end of October, the wolves came. It began as distant howling thin threads weaving through the wind, then closer, sharper, circling. Elias rose without a word, took the rifle from above the hearth, and stepped outside. Clara followed to the doorway, heart pounding. In the moonlight, the world was silver and black. Snowflakes drifted like ashes returning to sky. She could see shapes moving beyond the fence-line shadows with eyes. Elias fired once, the report echoing off the hills. The pack scattered, yelps fading. He waited, rifle steady, until silence returned. When he came back inside, she was still at the door, trembling. "They won't try again tonight," he said, setting the gun aside. "I didn't realize they came so near." "They smell new life," he answered. "Smoke, food, fire things worth guarding." She closed the door, leaned against it. "Then, thank you for guarding them." His smile was weary, but genuine. "Wasn't just them I was guarding." Something in her chest gave way, then a small, quiet breaking that felt like hope finding a crack. Snow fell the next morning, soft as dust from heaven. The world turned white, erasing burn scars and footprints alike. Clara stood on the threshold, watching flakes melt against her sleeve. Behind her, Elias poured coffee, the steam curling like ghosts. "What will you do come spring?" he asked. "I'll rebuild. Proper walls. A porch facing east." "Like he promised you?" She nodded. "But not for him. For me." He considered that, then said, "I could help. Got hands enough for it." She looked at him over her cup. "Why?" "Because a place worth guarding ought to be built by two people who believe in it." Quote. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, the snow kept falling, and the distance between them grew smaller than breath. That night, as the wind keened over the ridge, Clara lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of Elias's breathing across the roof. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, the train whistles, the burned timbers, the empty letter that had once promised a future. It struck her that she had found something rarer than she'd set out to claim. Not a husband by contract, but a witness to her survival. Outside, the wolves cried once more, farther away now. The sound mingled with the sigh of the fire and the faint heartbeat of snow against the roof. Clara turned toward the warmth, eyes closing. Tomorrow, they would start measuring the ground where a new porch would stand. And when spring came, she would read her letters to the sunrise at last this time, from a home she had built with her own hands, and with the quiet man who had taught her what endurance sounded like. The river and the vow. Winter broke the way glass does quietly, and all at once, by late March, the snow had pulled back from the hills, leaving behind veins of mud and the smell of thawing pine. The creek, once a silver thread, now rushed wild and brown with meltwater. Clara stood at its edge one morning, hem of her skirt damp, hair unpinned by wind. Behind her, the rebuilt lean-to against a half-finished frame of logs what would, by summer, become a house again. Elias watched from a short distance, leaning on his axe. The light struck him full dusty coat, scar along his arm, face set in the quiet strength she had come to recognize as care disguised as habit. He spoke rarely still, but when he did, his words felt carved rather than spoken, like something meant to last. "River's rising fast," he said. Clara nodded. "Everything's moving again. Feels like the world remembered us." "World forgets quick," he replied, stepping closer. "We remind it by building." She smiled faintly. "You think building's enough?" "For a start." He tossed a split log onto the pile and gestured to the half-framed wall. "You've got a good line here. Won't list in the wind." "I copied your corner joints," she admitted. "Then it'll stand." They worked through the morning. The rhythm of hammer and saw became its own kind of conversation. By noon, Clara's sleeves were rolled to her elbows, freckles dark against pale skin. Elias handed her nails one by one, his rough fingers brushing hers only by accident, but each touch carried a small spark neither mentioned. When the sun climbed high, she straightened, rubbing her neck. "We'll need shingles soon. I've got cedar boards drying in the shed." "You think of everything," she said, half teasing. He shrugged. "Out here, thinking ahead's the difference between living and telling a story someone else finishes for you." Quote. Clara glanced toward the horizon, where faint smoke from another homestead curled. "You ever go into town, Elias?" "Only when I have to." "Why?" "I've been thinking I should. Register the land. They'll want proof it's occupied before they reassign it." He stopped mid-swing, the axe head glinting. "You planning to stake it under your name?" "It's mine now. Thomas left no heirs." Elias studied her a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you'll need a witness." Quote. "You volunteering?" "Seems I already have been," he said, and returned to his work. They set the sill beam that afternoon. He showed her how to bed it in a thin layer of clay and ash to keep damp from crawling up into the grain. "Clay remembers water," he said, "so it knows how to say no." "Like a woman," Clara answered lightly. He huffed a laugh, rare and warm. "Some water's worth saying yes to." That evening, rain came soft at first, then steady. They carried tools inside, stacked the remaining planks against the wall. The fire crackled as Clara wrung water from her hair. Outside, thunder rolled down the valley like a slow drum. Elias poured coffee into tin cups, handed her one. The smell of chicory filled the cabin. "You've done a lot in one winter," he said. "I didn't have much choice. You could have left." "I could have," she agreed, staring into the fire. "But leaving felt like dying, and I'd done enough of that already." Quote, Elias looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "You talk about death like it's something you've known a long time." "It travels," she said softly. "From Boston to here, it just changes its shape." He nodded, as if that made sense. The firelight caught the scar on his cheek, one she hadn't noticed before, faint under stubble. She wanted to ask about it but didn't. He rarely offered stories, and she'd learned that quiet men give them only when they mean it. For a long time, neither spoke. The rain softened, then stopped. A silence settled thick as wool. "Elias," she said finally. He looked up. "When this house is done, will you stay?" He hesitated, thumb tracing the rim of his cup. "I hadn't thought that far." "I think you have," she said. "You build like a man who plans to stay." He smiled, small and crooked. "Maybe I just build like a man who's tired of moving." He set another log on the fire with care, as if any noise might frighten the future. A week later, the thaw became a flood. It began with the river swelling past its banks, greedy and fast. Clara woke to the roar of water and Elias's hand on her shoulder. "Up. We've got to move the horses." The door blew open under the wind's shove. The creek, now a churning brown serpent, had broken free, dragging branches and ice with it. Rain slashed sideways, stinging their faces. Clara grabbed what she could lantern, coat, the Bible she'd saved from the ashes. They fought through mud to the corral. The younger mare screamed, eyes rolling. Elias caught her reins, voice low and calm over the storm. "Easy, girl. Easy now." Clara waited beside him, water up to her knees. "It's rising fast." He looked toward the ridge. "We head for the bluff. Move." They led the horses uphill, as the current tore loose fence posts behind them. A tree went down with a crack like gunfire. Clara stumbled once, the flood tugging her sideways, but Elias caught her arm, pulling her close until they reached higher ground. By the time they reached the bluff, both were soaked to the bone. Below, the valley churned everything they'd built half submerged. The half-finished frame of the cabin leaned, then surrendered to the current, boards spinning away like driftwood ghosts. Clara sank to her knees. "It's gone again." And Elias stood behind her, chest heaving, rain dripping from his hat brim. "You're still here," he said. "That's what matters." She turned toward him, eyes fierce despite the cold. "It was ours. It still can be," he said simply, and knelt beside her. "We'll build higher, stronger." She stared at him, this man who never promised what he couldn't keep, and realized that, for him, the word "we" was a vow. No need for rings, nor ceremony. The land itself was their witness. They took shelter in a cave above the ridge that night, sharing the small fire Elias coaxed from wet wood. Steam rose from their clothes, his shirt clung dark to his shoulders. She sat across from him, wrapped in his blanket, hands trembling less from cold than from something else, something she couldn't name yet. He noticed her watching. "You're thinking loud," he said, "just remembering. I thought when I came west I'd find a husband and a home. I never thought I'd be the one to build either." "You built both," he said quietly. "Just not how you planned." Her breath caught. The way he said it wasn't flattery, it was truth, simple and steady. She smiled faintly. "You always talk like that?" "Like what?" "Like you're carving the words into wood." He shrugged. "Wood lasts longer than most talk." The fire popped, sending sparks up the rock walls. Outside, the rain finally eased to a whisper. Clara leaned back, eyes closing for the first time since dawn. "When morning comes, what then?" "We dig again," Elias said. "Start where the ground's still dry, maybe near the cottonwoods." "Another beginning," she murmured. "That's the only kind worth making." Morning brought a hush, the kind that follows destruction. The air was clean, the sky stripped blue. Down below, the flood had scoured the valley, leaving behind slick mud and uprooted timber. Their cabin was a ruin again, but the world itself felt rinsed. Clara and Elias walked the perimeter in silence. Once, she bent to retrieve a broken plank, the one she'd carved her initials into, beside the door. The letters CW were half burned, half washed, yet still legible. She turned it over in her hands. "It survived both fires," she said. "Then it's lucky wood," he replied. "We'll use it again." She smiled. "You really mean to start over?" "Wouldn't be the first time." Go. "Elias, doesn't it tire you, the rebuilding?" He looked toward the horizon, where snow peaks gleamed. "Maybe. But buildings how? I remember. I'm still alive." Her throat tightened. "Then let's remember together." Spring. They worked through April. The new cabin rose slow but sure, built on stone higher up the ridge. Clara learned to plane boards, to swing a hammer without bruising her palm. Elias taught her how to tell good timber from rot by sound alone. "A solid tree rings like truth," he'd said, tapping his knuckle against the grain. They set stones for a chimney, hands scratched and blackened with soot and lime. She kept count of the courses, he kept the plumb. When the wind gusted, they sheltered behind the half-built wall and shared bread torn by hand, the crumbs flying like small birds. At night they read by lamplight, her voice carrying passages from the Pilgrim's Progress while he repaired gear or sharpened tools. Sometimes he'd hum low, tuneless, like wind through wire. Sometimes she'd stop reading just to listen. One evening she caught him sketching in charcoal on a scrap of paper. "What's that?" she asked. "Map. Trying to see where the river bends now." She leaned closer. "You draw like a surveyor." "Used to be one," he said, surprising her. "Before the war." Quote, "You fought?" He nodded once. "South of Vicksburg. Left me a few ghosts, none worth keeping." "And you came west to lose them?" "West doesn't erase ghosts," he said. "Just gives them more room to wander." She studied him a moment. "Then maybe it's time you gave them a home instead." He met her gaze. "You volunteering to build it with me?" Her lips curved. "Maybe I already am." They cut rafters from a stand of lodgepole pine up the draw. He taught her how to side along a board for a twist, how to mark a birdsmith cut with a carpenter's square so the rafters would sit sweet on the plate. "A roof is a promise," he said. "It's only honest if it doesn't leak." "Same with words," she answered. "Same with vows," he added after a beat, the word landing between them, like a tool set down carefully. When the frame stood true, they rested on the ridge line and drank water from the same dipper. Below them the valley resembled a page, half-written, river lines scrawled fresh, meadow grass making notes in green. She pointed to a flat stretch above the old course. "Garden goes there," she said. "Beans can reach for your new eaves." "They'll reach," he said. "Everything does." The flood's price. In May the river calmed, but it left a hunger in the ground that made the lowest places treacherous. They learned the new current by heart. Elias cut a ford where the bottom was gravel and set flat stones where mud tried to pretend it was safe. On a warm afternoon Clara, careless with relief, stepped onto a patch of slick clay near the bank. The earth slid out from under her. The river took her ankles with a quick, cold hand. "Elias!" He was there before the second cry, boot heels carving trenches as he braced and reached. She caught his wrist bone and rope, and he hauled her into the grass. They lay side by side, chests heaving, the sky spinning overhead like a coin. "I thought," she began, and couldn't find the end of the sentence. "Me too," he said. She rolled toward him, water streaming from her hair. "The river doesn't love us." "It doesn't hate us either," he answered. "It just is. We're the ones who have to decide." She sat up, drew a breath that tasted of mud and metal and gratitude. Then she dipped her hand into the shallows and lifted a palmful of water between them. It trembled, sunshot. "Then hear me," she said to the river, to him, to whatever listened. "We will not ask you to be other than yourself. We will build where you don't want to live. We will respect your seasons, and when you take what's yours, we will begin again." Elias took her wet hand in his. "And I'll say mine," he added, voice low. "When the water rises, I'll raise you higher. When the work is too heavy, I'll carry it with you. When the world forgets us, I'll remind it by building." Close. They let the water slide back. It made no answer, but it did not pull them in again. That was enough. The ceremony no one saw. 2 nights later, they carried 2 small river stones up to the cottonwoods. He had polished them on his jeans without saying why. She had wrapped a length of blue thread around one like a secret. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the place where the ground sloped gently toward the valley. Fireflies were just beginning their language in the grass. The house frame stood behind them, dark against the deepening sky. Elias cleared his throat. "Clara Whitfield," he said. She looked at him, and the name sounded like a chapter ending. He started again, choosing better. "Clara," he said simply. "Do you want to vow with me?" "I do," she answered, pulse jumping in her throat. He set one stone in her palm and kept the other in his. "This is for the river to hold if we forget. Say yours." Quote. She swallowed, then spoke, careful, like placing bricks. "I vow to build with you and not above you. I vow to mend what weather breaks, and forgive what work cannot fix in a day. I vow to keep the door unlatched when you're late, and the lamp trimmed when you're tired. I vow to say your name softly when the wind is loud." He nodded, eyes bright in the dusk. "I vow to add my strength to yours, not stack it over it. I vow to cut straight, to speak plain, to leave room for silence that isn't distance. I vow to be a roof and a shoulder, and to rebuild when the river says, 'Try again.'" They swapped stones. He tucked hers into the crook of the cottonwood where the bark had split. She pressed his into the seam between 2 roots, covered it with leaf mold. The night accepted both quietly. "There," he said. "There," she echoed. They did not kiss. They stood and listened while the river practiced its endless sentence under the hill. It sounded like a future that wasn't in a hurry. Living into the vow. By May, wildflowers covered the hills. The sound of hammering gave way to birdsong. The new house stood ready for its roof, a proper chimney waiting for stone. Clara hung the blue quilt she'd been stitching her first since Boston across the doorway. The patchwork caught the wind like a flag. Elias stood beside her, looking at the valley below. "You did it," he said. "We did," she corrected. He tipped his hat back, eyes warm. "Feels strange, seeing it finished." "Not finished," she said. "Lived in. That's the difference." He nodded, thoughtful. "You ever think about what comes after?" She turned to him. "After what?" "After we're done building, you'll need to go into town soon, register the claim, maybe buy seed." "I will. But I'll need a last name for the papers." Quote. The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Elias cleared his throat. "You could use Whitfield still. Ain't no law says you can't." "I could," she said softly. "But it feels like that name belongs to the ashes, not the river." He looked away toward the flow below. "Then maybe it's time for a new one." She smiled faintly. "You offering one?" He hesitated long enough that the wind filled the silence. Then, simply, "Mercer fits on the line easy." Clara's eyes softened. "You'd sign that for me?" "I would." Her hand found his, calloused palm meeting slender fingers. "Then that's your vow," she said. "And mine." They sealed it the only way the frontier trusted, by working. He tightened the sill bolts. She set the hearthstones level one by one, fingernails black with soil. He hung the door plumb. She rubbed oil into the lintel until it shone. The road to town. The next morning they rode to town, her in a borrowed blue dress, him in his least worn coat. The trail wound through fields now green again, cottonwoods glittering with new leaves. Meadowlarks stitched brightness onto the air. They forded the river at the shallow cut he'd made, pausing long enough for both to glance toward the cottonwood roots where a river stone slept. Fort Mullen was more dust than fort now, but the dust carried its own kind of order. The blacksmith's hammer kept the hour. The telegrapher's bell supplied the minutes. The murmur of the general store filled in the rest. They stopped first at the store. Clara traded 2 jars of honey and a hem repair on a neighbor's shirt for a bolt of unbleached muslin and a packet of bean seed. The storekeeper, Mrs. Greaves, small, fast, and persuasively cheerful, peered over her spectacles. "You two fixing to stay?" she asked. "Seems we are," Elias said. "Good," Mrs. Greaves replied. "Places get better when people choose them on purpose." At the courthouse, the clerk looked up, surprised. "Afternoon," Elias said. "We're here to register a homestead claim. 2 signers." The clerk glanced between them, puzzled. "Married couple?" Elias started to answer, but Clara spoke first. "Partners in land and work," she said. "The paper can decide what to call that." The man shrugged. "Makes no difference to me. Sign here, both of you." And she wrote carefully, Clara Mercer, the pen scratching steady across the page. Elias added his name beside hers. When they stepped back into the sunlight, the bell over the telegraph office rang somewhere down the street, marking noon. Clara looked at him, smiling. "That's that, then. Paper says it's ours," Elias replied. "But truth's been ours a while." They lingered a moment on the boardwalk, not wanting to outrun the size of the thing they'd done. A boy chased a dog. A teamster swore at a stuck wheel. Somewhere, someone tried a fiddle and found the key. Ordinary life fanned out around them, and for once it included them, not as survivors, but as citizens of a place. On their way out, the postmistress stopped them with a small, brown-wrapped parcel. "Came through yesterday, addressed to the porch that faces east," she said, amused. "Thought I'd trust my instincts." Clara unwrapped it on the courthouse steps. Inside lay a thin book of poems with a sprig of pressed willow tucked at the title page. No note. She looked at Elias. He lifted a shoulder. "Levi," they said at the same time, and smiled. Hearth and paper. That evening they returned to the cabin. The first thing she did was hang the signed paper above the hearth, pinned with a horseshoe nail. The second was to light a fire beneath it. Outside, dusk slid across the land in slow amber waves. Inside, the air glowed warm with wood smoke and something gentler peace. Perhaps, though neither spoke the word aloud. Elias sat on the step, boots muddy, watching her through the open door. "You ever think about going back east?" he asked. "Sometimes," she admitted, "in dreams. But it feels smaller there now, like a room I outgrew." He nodded. "Happens that way." She joined him on the step. For a long while they watched the river flash silver in the fading light. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft enough to be almost prayer. "We built this from ruin twice over." He looked at her, eyes steady. "Then it'll hold through anything. And if it burns again?" He smiled faintly. "Then we build again. That's the vow, isn't it?" She leaned her head against his shoulder. The simplest answer of all, the porch that faces east. Morning woke to the sound of a nuthack tapping the same note until the house agreed with it. Clara brewed coffee strong enough to mend a mood. Elias set the new porch boards, saving the edge cuts to make a shallow shelf for the book of poems and the ledger. "If we're going to write a life," he said, "we ought to keep the ink handy." They christened the porch with bread and jam and a reading. Clara opened the little book where the pressed willow had slept and read a poem about water forgetting and remembering. She stopped at a line that felt like a nail hitting home. "Listen," she said, and read it again. And Elias nodded the way men nod when a thing is both obvious and holy. They worked lighter that day, letting the house introduce itself to the weather. In the afternoon, Clara stitched a thin curtain for the east window, sky-colored and obedient. Elias planed the bench edge where a splinter had set its own mind. They said little, not from lack, but from having burned through all the words that weren't essential. As evening leaned in, they walked down to the cottonwoods. The stones were where they'd left them. A small strand of grass had begun to grow beside the one she'd tucked under the roots. "See?" she whispered. He crouched and touched the leaf with a fingertip. Things keep their end of a bargain when they can. On the way back, they crossed the new garden plot. Elias stooped and pressed his palm to the soil. "Warm," he said. "Tomorrow, beans." "Tomorrow," she agreed. What the river kept. A week later, a storm rose sudden and brief, a fistful of rain. A little thunder. The sort of tantrum that teaches nothing and cleans everything. After it passed, they walked the bank to be sure no new mischief had been made. Caught under a snag of willow roots, Clara saw a flash of something pale. She knelt and pulled free. A bit of wood splintered, smooth, familiar. It was the piece she'd carved with her initials back in the first cabin. CW, she turned it in her hand. I thought I'd lost this. River kept it till you were ready, Elias said. At the bench, he set a small recess with his chisel and inlaid the fragment flush with the grain. Then, beside it, with the gentleness of a man carving into his own skin, he cut CM and below it, EM. Not big, not boastful. Just enough. Now the bench knows our names, he said. And the river does too, she answered. That night she wrote in the ledger, vow by water, paper by fire, names by wood. The house is learning us, she added, in small script at the bottom margin. The dead leave room, the living fill it carefully. The first festival of ordinary. They made a small festival of the first truly ordinary day. No storms, no floods, no messengers, no losses that had to be carried like a hot brand. Just sun, a polite breeze. The sound of bees practicing numbers in the clover. Clara baked a loaf that rose like a well-told story. Elias fixed the latch that had never quite agreed with the jam. Together they set beans in the softened dirt. 3 to a hill, because that was how Mrs. Greaves's mother had done it. And who were they to argue with a rhythm that had lasted longer than the courthouse? At noon he brought out 2 enamel cups of well water and a slice of cheese that remembered the morning's cool. To vows, he said. To vows, she echoed, clinking the cups. And to tomorrow, he added. And to tomorrow, she agreed. They drank. It tasted like a thing you could keep. As the sun slid toward evening, she sat on the porch that faced east and opened the book of poems to a page she had not meant to find. The poem said, "Build as if you will be asked to explain it to the river." She shut the book, smiling. "We have been," she said. Elias looked up from the fence post he was sighting. "And we told the truth," she replied. He went back to his work, whistling something that wasn't a tune so much as an answer. A quiet benediction. Later, when the stars came out sharp and clean as hammered nails, Elias banked the fire and turned toward the valley. The water whispered below like memory, patient and endless. Beside him, Clara dozed, her hand still in his. He spoke softly, to her or the land, it was hard to tell. "Some things don't need words," he said, "but I'll keep saying them anyway." Quote, the wind edged through the cottonwoods, translating everything into a language they both understood. The porch, the bench, the signed paper above the hearth, the 2 stones at the roots, the beam with its inlaid letters, each kept the vow in its own way. And the river, no longer an enemy, no longer a test, moved past the house with the indifferent grace of a god who has been properly acknowledged, and so can get back to the work of being a river. By morning the beans had lifted the soil like a quilt pulled gently from a sleeping body. Elias laughed out loud when he saw it. Clara knelt and touched the tiny curved backs. "Welcome," she said. They ate, they worked, they rested. The day made no argument and needed none. When evening came, they carried 2 chairs to the porch and let the dark arrive without commentary. Somewhere, a nightjar closed and opened its one good note. The house breathed with them. "I'm glad we did it by the river," she said at last. "Me too," he answered. "What would you have said if I hadn't? I'd have kept building till you did." She turned her face toward him in the dark. "That might have taken a while." "I've got a while," he said. The vow didn't glitter. It didn't shout. It didn't even need to be repeated. It settled into the joints the way oil does, keeping friction from becoming fire, letting weight be borne without complaint. And when sleep finally took them, it was the right kind, the kind that comes after deliberate work, and the simplest possible hope spoken aloud. That the roof would hold, the river would mind itself, the beans would keep their promise, and the morning would find their names exactly where they had left them, on wood, on paper, on water, on one another. The letter and the storm. The next morning dawned a pale yellow, the kind of light that makes even the wreckage look orderly. The fallen cottonwood lay half in the river, half sprawled on the bank like a stunned giant. Steam rose from its blackened heart where the lightning had punched through. Levi Hale stood with his hands on his hips, studying the stump. "Never did like that tree," he said, as if disliking a tree could speed a saw. Elias set the crosscut and nodded toward the far handle. "We'll take it in rounds. Keep your back straight." They fell to it. Pull, breathe. Pull, teeth chewing the soaked wood. Breath finding the old rhythm men share when there's nothing left but work between them. Clara brought coffee and a pail at mid-morning and watched them from the shade of the porch. They looked like brothers when they didn't speak, same stubborn set to the shoulders, same economy in motion. The saw sang and the river answered, and it seemed that all the loudness in the world had been spent in the night. They stacked the rounds under the eaves. Levi wiped his brow with the back of his wrist. "Where do you keep your writing things?" he asked. Clara blinked. "Writing?" He nodded. "I've a letter to make honest." She fetched the box from the shelf ink, a stub of blue pencil. 2 envelopes gone soft at the corners. Levi sat at the table a long moment, like a man taking measure of a prayer, then wrote in a neat workman's hand. When he finished, he sanded the page with a pinch of flour to keep the ink from smearing, and slid it into an envelope. "To the land office," he said, sealing it with a damp thumb. "I declare I've no claim left here. It's paid." He glanced at them both. In labor and in love, law ought to recognize both, even when it forgets to. Elias held out his hand. They didn't shake like men making a promise. They shook like men acknowledging one that had already been made by fire and rain. Levi tucked the letter inside his coat. "There's a post in Fort Mullen. I'll carry it myself." "Will you come back through?" Clara asked, surprising herself by wanting him to. Levi considered, eyes drifting to the river, as if answers could be panned from it. "Maybe, when it's cooler. Your roof won't need holding then." "Roofs always need holding," Elias said. "They just don't say so." Levi smiled, the expression finally finding his face without a fight. "You two will be all right." "We already are," Clara said. He left near noon, the cotton under his horse's hooves giving way to the dusty rattle of the trail. He turned in the saddle once and tipped his hat, then vanished into the wavering air where the heat made distance look like water. After he was gone, the valley felt quieter but not emptier, the way a house does after guests who brought blessing rather than weight. They cut the rest of the tree by afternoon and dragged the rounds under the shed. Elias split a few to test their dryness. The heartwood gleamed, rain-charged and clean. "We'll cure the good lengths for winter," he said. "What's left becomes a bench." "A bench that remembers lightning," Clara said. "That's a thing I'd read on." Quote. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat with that slow half-smile that had become, lately, a place to rest. They numbered the bench slats with grease pencil 1, 2, 3, because even mercy benefits from order. When the sun leaned low, they quit for the day. Elias set his hat on the rail. Clara fetched a needle and the small tin of buttons she had rescued from the wreck of another life. She counted them without thinking 37, some shell, some horn, one with a chip shaped like a crescent moon. She threaded 3 onto a string and hung them from a nail near the door. "For luck," she said. "For listening," Elias corrected softly. "Doorways like to know when you've come in." That night, the heat retreated, as if the rain had taken its pride with it. They ate under the open porch roof bread, sliced tomatoes warmed by afternoon sun, and cheese that tasted faintly of the sage it had borrowed from the air. The river spoke without hurrying. Fireflies found the low grass. When the lamps were out, the dark came easy. Sometime before dawn, Clara woke to the smell of creosote and heaven-wet earth still telling its story. She lay listening to Elias's breathing and counting the slow drip from the eave into the bucket they'd forgotten to move. Each drip a bead on a string, each bead the size of a second she was willing to live exactly as she was. In the morning, the world had dried to a clean dullness. She set bread to rise. Elias pointed to the far slope. "Cows busted the west wire during the storm. I'll take a coil and set it right." "I'll come," she said. "You'll read me the line," he amended, pleased. And so they went, 2 people and a coil of barbed wire, a hammer, a sack of staples, and an old idea about the world that had learned to be new. They found the break at a washout where the water had chewed through the earth, and left the fence hanging like a loose thought. Elias dug new post holes, tamped the dirt, shouldered the weight of each creosote sour pole. Clara held the posts plumb and true, her hands steady, her feet set like a promise. When they tightened the wire, the fence sang low, metallic, satisfied. "Good," Elias said. "That note means it'll hold." "What about us?" she asked, less a question than a testing of sound. He drew the last staple home. "We hum the same." They walked the line home, checking, touching, confirming. Near the cottonwoods, a meadowlark shivered the air with a song that climbed and then fell in a perfect brave tumble. Clara smiled. If letters could sing, they'd sound like that. Quote, "Yours do," Elias said. At noon the heat returned, as it always would, unashamed of having failed to cow them. Clara set the table inside and, while the dough finished its rise, she opened the ledger and copied out a paragraph from the unsent letter into the back page, as if the book itself might need reminding. "I am alive. The life I was meant to live has just begun." She pressed the page with her palm and felt an echo under her skin, real heart against ink heart, both agreeing to keep the beat. After they ate, she napped on the floor where it was cooler, a folded blanket under her head, the hum of summer in her ears. She woke to the sound of a horse she didn't recognize and took a careful breath before standing. It wasn't Levi. She would know his seat in the saddle by now. It was the male rider, hat low, eyes salt white at the corners from too much Sunday. "Fort Mullen, East Run," he said, swinging down with a grunt. "Got papers for Mercer, and a handbill, if you like old songs about dirt." Elias took the bundle, signed the stub, and passed the rider a cup of well water and a wedge of bread big as a fist. The man ate like he was coiling energy back into himself. "Levi Hale come through yesterday," the rider said between bites. "Posted a letter to the land office with a note for the registrar himself. Looked like a man who'd set down a rock he'd been carrying too long." Elias's mouth twitched. We felt the ground rise when he did. When the rider had gone, Clara and Elias opened the packet together. Most of it was ordinary twine-wrapped notice about taxes that could wait, a broadside about a fair 50 miles away, where someone promised to make music from a saw. At the bottom lay a slip from the land office acknowledging receipt of a relinquishment from Mr. Levi Hale, and noting that the present occupant's improvements satisfy the spirit and letter of Homestead requirement. Clara exhaled a laugh that hurt like a healed bruise. "Improvements," she murmured, thinking of the storm and the mud and the fireline trench and the not yet bench, and of mercy, which had made the legal word feel literal. Elias read the line twice, not because he doubted it, but because he was learning to let good news echo. "Spirit and letter," he said. "For once they agree." In the cool hour before dusk, Clara gathered the drying herb bundles down from the rafters and shook them gently. The room filled with a clean green smell that made something in her chest spread its shoulders. Elias planed the bench planks until the shavings curled like pale ribbon. The slats lay in a neat row on trestles, numbers chalked on their ends. "You ever think," he asked, "that what we build remembers the weather that made it?" "I hope so," she said. "Otherwise, what's the point of surviving storms, if not to sit with them, turn to wood?" They assembled the bench as the light went to honey. Mortises snug, pegs tapped home, oil rubbed in with cloth until the grain lifted its story out of the board. When they set it against the east wall, it looked inevitable, the way a word looks when you've finally found the right one. Clara Saturday. The wood was warm from their hands. She ran her fingers along a faint char where lightning had once been a tongue. "You're a good translator," she told the bench. "From fire to seat." "Say that to me?" Elias said mildly. She turned her head, met his eyes. "You're a good translator. From danger to living. You help," he said. They watched a hawk draw circles above the far pasture until the sky softened to blue-gray. Bats made sensibly small decisions in the near dark. Somewhere across the river, a cow lowed once, long and content. When the first star appeared, Clara whispered the old rhyme to it, not superstitious. just companionable, and wished, if wishing had any say, for the kind of peace that doesn't brag. A week later, because paper has its own hunger whether or not you feed it, they rode into town to sign the registrar's book and to buy nails and a bolt of unbleached muslin. The road there was all light and dust and grasshoppers that threw themselves cheerfully at the future. Fort Mullen wasn't a fort anymore, so much as a promise that had grown out of its uniform. The general store smelled of leather and tobacco and sweet rot from a cracked molasses barrel. The registrar's office was a window hung with a bell that rang as if relieved to see people who meant their own names. The registrar, a narrow-shouldered man in a linen waistcoat, peered over half-moon spectacles. "Mercer," he said, sounding out the letters as if tasting unfamiliar fruit. Yes, saw the hail relinquishment cross my desk. Sad business about his brother." He dipped his pen. "This will be a formality. Sign here and here." He looked up. "You've weathered a flood and a lightning-struck tree, I hear." "News travels like seeds on a wind," Clara said. "Not a bad way for it to go," the registrar answered, surprising her with a flicker of poetry. He sprinkled sand over the signatures, shook it off, and slid the paper across. "Keep this copy for your records. I advise a frame if you've the lumber." "Weave the tree," Elias said. Outside, a woman in a crisp calico dress glanced from Clara to Elias, and then to the paper in Clara's hand. "Mercer's," she said, with the offhand approval of someone appreciating a good fence. "Storm had nothing on you both." At the post office, the postmistress round, quick-eyed handed Clara a small parcel wrapped in newsprint. "Came through from Bozeman, looks like a book. The man who posted it said to tell you, for the porch that faces mornings. He didn't leave his name." Clara untied the string on the step and revealed a slim volume. Walden, or Life in the Woods. She traced the letters with her thumb and tried on the idea that someone in Bozeman, perhaps Levi, had thought to give her a book about attention. She smiled. "I'll read it aloud," she said to Elias. "Every page?" he asked mock-wary. "Every sentence that doesn't lie." They stayed late in town because the farrier had to rasp the roan's front hoof, which had grown a crooked idea. Jonas, drowsy from heat and curiosity, fell asleep against a stack of grain sacks in the store, while Clara bartered jarred honey for nails and blue thread. She felt, not for the first time, that exchange was a vernacular she had learned late and was eager to speak. On the ride home, dusk burned the sage to copper. Far off, heat lightning flickered over the low hills but kept its thunder to itself. Elias shifted in the saddle to ride close, the comfort of a knee bumping against a stirrup leather. The world smelled of dust and communion. "Think Levi sent the book?" he asked after a while. "Feels like his kind of thank you, heavy and quiet." "He'll turn up again," Elias said. "When the weather says so," she agreed. At the river crossing, a pair of deer stood wide and still as if listening. They didn't bolt when the horses came near. They only watched, ears working. Clara lifted a hand in greeting a foolish gesture, but the only one that fit. They reached home in the last blue before dark. The bench waited the way good furniture does, half alive and willing to be more. Clara set the registrar's paper on the mantel in a frame Elias had nailed together by lantern light. It looked less official and more true there, like a family portrait of words. That night, after Jonas slept and the wind turned from the west and brought cooler air, Clara read from the book by lamplight. She skipped the parts that scolded and lingered over the parts that asked questions in clean language. When she'd finished a page that described living deliberately, she closed the cover and held it a moment. "What's deliberate?" Elias asked, testing the word like a new tool in his hand. "Slow on purpose," she said. "Brave on purpose. Choosing on purpose." "And," he nodded, "we do that. We are learning to," she said. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, as if trying to read something written there in smoke. "You ever think," he said at last, "that lightning is just the sky choosing us faster than we can choose ourselves?" "It chose that tree," she said. "And we chose to make it a bench," he answered. "That's the rest of the work." Days slid like cards across a table, face up, face down, but all of them theirs. Elias mended harness and set a new hinge on the barn door and cut pegs for the rack he'd promised her months back. Clara boiled jars for late summer pickles and stitched a cover for the bench from old shirts so faded they'd forgotten what color meant. Jonas built a city of river stones at the edge of the porch step and named its streets for whatever he could see. Sparrow Road, Elm Avenue, Cloud Lane that changed direction as often as cloud does. One afternoon, the heat struck too hard. The air pressed down until even the flies gave up arguing. Clara moved a bucket of water into the shade for the barn cat and wetted the hem of a cloth to lay across the boy's neck. Elias split 3 logs and stopped, a sensible man knowing when to let the day win. Under the low lull of the hour, a memory rose in Clara, unbidden Boston's narrow summer. All brick and reflected glare, the sound of wheels on cobbles, letters that spoke of futures with neat corners. She looked around at her life. Now no corners anywhere, only curves. River, hills, the bend of a man's shoulder under a clean shirt, the arc of a question that didn't need an answer to be useful. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked. "That I was hungry and didn't know for what," she said. "And now? Now I'm full, and still hungry, but in the good way, wanting to live enough to get tired of it by nightfall." He nodded like a man who had learned the same lesson in a different grammar. When evening finally loosened the day's grip, a breath of wind came up the river. The cottonwoods sounded like pages turning. Clara brought the ledger to the porch and wrote, "Levi's letter posted, registrar's paper framed, bench from lightning finished. The house is a listening thing." She sat back and listened to it, the small adjustments wood makes after heat. The mouse under the step deciding to be elsewhere. The cooling chimney telling itself a bedtime story. She thought unexpectedly of Thomas Hale. She could see his careful script in the letters he'd sent, the shy hope in each line. "Yours faithfully," he'd written and meant it. She placed a hand on the bench and whispered, "He left room." Not guilt, not the kind that rots a beam from within room, like space in a sentence for a breath. "What did you say?" Elias asked, stepping out with 2 cups. "That the dead who loved us leave room," she said. "We did not take this place from him. We took it forward." He handed her a cup. "Then we'll keep moving that way." They drank in a companionable silence, punctuated by crickets, whose insistence felt like confidence. Somewhere a nightjar called like a door closing gently. Far away, beyond even that, thunder tried a few syllables and then decided to save its speech for another time. On the last morning of true heat before a cooler spell, a rider paused at their gate and left a folded paper under a stone. When Elias brought it in, the 3 of them gathered at the table to read. It was from Levi, 2 lines in that same steady hand. Paper filed. Claim withdrawn. "If ever I come back, I'd like a seat on the bench that used to be a tree, that used to be a spear." Then, as if embarrassed by poetry, he had signed it. L. Hale. Clara smiled. "We'll keep a space," she said. "For all the selves things used to be," Elias added. By late August, the valley let them breathe again. The river fattened a little. The grass tried on green the way a man tries on a joke, pleased when it works, unhurt when it doesn't. They dug the trench Hale had started a touch deeper, set flat stones in its floor so water would run even when the earth was shocked into forgetting where to go. They planted willow cuttings along the bank. "Root well," Clara told them, not caring if anyone heard. On a Sunday, they rode to the cedar where a small cross stood, to check the soil and the slope and the way the light fell. Clara brought a packet of seeds, blue flax and yarrow, the sort of brave flowers that don't mind poor ground. She pressed them into the dirt with thumb and forefinger. Jonas inched close, solemn as a minister. "They'll find their names," he whispered. Elias stood with his hat over his heart for a moment that belonged only to him and the sky. On the ride back, he said, "Levi was right in his way. He came to see if anything had been wasted. He looked at the cabin and the fence and the bench caught sideways in the rising light. Nothing was." That night, the first geese arrowed south in a ragged V, calling to one another like travelers agreeing on an inn. Clara stood in the doorway and counted them without keeping tally. The sound made her throat ache. She didn't know why, not exactly. Maybe because leaving and staying can sound the same from the right distance. Elias came to stand behind her, his hand gentle on the small place above her elbow that had come to belong to him, in the way good places do not by taking, but by standing near. "What would your letter say now?" he asked. "The same thing," she said, "but with more room between the words." He nodded. "Room is what keeps things from burning when they get hot." "Room is the mercy that came as rain," she said. They went inside. He banked the lamp. She set the book on the mantel beside the framed paper. The pine horse. The blue jar. The house sighed in the switch from light to dark, as houses do when they are allowed to be more than a shelter, when they are allowed to be a name. Sometime deep in the night, a breeze came through the crack the storm had widened in the sill, and moved the page of Walden open, then shut again, as if someone had read the sentence and agreed. The bench held it silent. The river turned over once in its sleep. Before dawn, Clara woke and lay listening to the small chorus a home makes when no one asks it to prove itself. She reached for the ledger and wrote without lighting the lamp, letting the pencil find its own way. Lightning to bench, stranger to brother, paper to peace. We keep what we make, and we are made by what we keep. When morning found them, it was gentler than it had been in months. The sky wore a temperate blue. The cottonwoods cupped their leaves as if to catch the day and pass it back, unspilled. Clara brewed coffee. Elias stepped out and returned with dust on his boots and satisfaction on his mouth. Jonas woke slow, hair going 9 directions, eyes full of the idea of breakfast. They ate. They lived. The porch faced east and made its own weather when it needed to. The letter stayed where she had nailed it, unsent and entirely true. The valley breathed the same truth back to them, in a tongue that was equal parts bee and hammer and river. The storm had asked a harsh question. Their answer was a house that listened. And every morning after, whether the day leaned hot or turned merciful, they signed their names to that answer again, with bread, with wire, with water, with the deliberate choosing that turns time into a place to sit. And if sometimes late, when the wind stooped to tell the grass old stories and the bench remembered fire in its bones, Clara laid a palm flat to the wood and added softly, "We stayed." There was nothing in the world. No registrar, no rider, no weather that could call that a lie. The winter of names. By November, frost rimed the porch rails like lace. The river ran slow and clear, its summer rage forgotten. Every morning before dawn, Clara rose to coax fire from the ashes. The first breath of heat filled the cabin with a sleepy glow. The kettle sighed, the rafters creaked, and she felt the day find its shape. Outside, the sky paled from blue to pearl. Elias was already a dark figure against the light-splitting logs, his swing even and sure, breath turning white in the cold. She watched for a moment through the window, that familiar ache of gratitude catching in her chest. It had been almost a year since she'd stepped off a wagon into the smoke of a burned cabin. Now the valley held a different silence, not the hollow kind, but the kind made by belonging. She poured 2 tin cups of coffee. When the door opened, a gust of snow and pine swept in with him. "Cold's early this year," he said, brushing his beard with one gloved hand. The frost in it glittered like filings of silver. Storm brewing from the north ridge. "Then we'd best finish stacking wood," she said. "You'll stay by the hearth till your hands thaw. Doctor's orders." "You're no doctor." "Just wise from scars." She laughed softly and passed him the cup. Their fingers brushed familiar, deliberate, never careless. That brief touch contained a year's worth of understanding. When the sun climbed, Elias saddled his horse to ride the fence line, and Clara followed the riverbank to gather kindling. The air was sharp, the world hushed. Her boots left dark prints that filled quickly with snow. Halfway back she stopped. A sound rode the wind, a thin, broken cry. Human, she listened again. There, dropping her bundle, she ran. The wind slapped her skirt against her legs, breath burning in her throat. Beyond the cottonwoods lay an overturned wagon, its wheel half buried in drift. The mule was still in the traces, steam frozen in its hair. And, beneath the wreck movement, a boy, small, maybe 6, wrapped in a coat far too big. His lips were blue, his eyes wide with that wild mix of fear and disbelief that belongs only to children who have seen too much. "It's all right," Clara whispered, kneeling. "You're safe now." "Ma," she followed his gaze. A woman lay near the wheel, pinned beneath a beam, her face pale against the snow. Clara crawled to her, pressing fingers to her neck, warm but fading fast. "Hold on," Clara begged. "We'll get help." The woman's eyes fluttered open. "Please. My boy name's Jonas. Don't let him—" The rest dissolved into the wind. Clara felt the last tremor pass through her fingers. For a moment the only sound was the wind pushing through the reeds. Then she turned. The child was standing there, trembling, clutching a strip of cloth torn from his mother's skirt. "It's all right, Jonas," she said again, forcing her voice steady. "You'll come home with me." Elias saw her before she reached the ridge, her cloak dark with snow, a small bundle in her arms. He swung down and strode toward her. "What happened?" "Wagon accident by the bend. The mother's gone." Elias looked once at the boy's face and understood the rest. "Let's get them inside." Quote, they rode double, the child between them, wrapped in Clara's cloak. The snow thickened, each flake bright against the gathering dusk. At the cabin, Elias flung open the door and fed the fire until it roared. Clara laid Jonas near the hearth, rubbing his stiff hands, spooning warm broth between his lips. When at last color crept into the boy's cheeks, she exhaled a shaky prayer. "He'll live," Elias said quietly, from beside the hearth. "She wanted him safe," Clara answered. "That's all she asked." He studied the sleeping child, then her. "Then we'll keep him safe." "Just for the night," she said, but the words felt thin, even as she spoke them. The storm came hard and stayed. For 5 days wind walled them in, turning the world outside to a white blur. The door had to be shouldered open each morning. The river froze, its surface glinting dull as tin. Jonas woke often, crying for a mother he would not see again. Clara gathered him into her arms each time, whispering old hymns until he slept. She discovered that grief could fit in the crook of one's elbow. Elias built a small bed from spare boards, smoothing the edges with sandpaper until the pine shone pale and soft. He braced the legs with a crossbar, tested it twice, then ran his rough palm along the rail as if blessing it into strength. One night, as snow hissed against the window, Clara found him carving by firelight. "What's that?" she asked. He held up a tiny horse, its form rough but earnest. For him, he should have something to hold that isn't grief. She smiled, tired, but full. "You surprise me, Elias Mercer, only because you keep expecting the old me." "There's an old you?" she teased. He shrugged. "A quieter one, man who thought he was done with family." Her gaze drifted to Jonas asleep under the quilt. "Maybe family's not something you finish. Maybe it keeps finding you." He looked at her a long time. "Seems it just did." The storm wore itself thin at the edges, as storms do when they've said all they can. On the 6th morning the wind fell silent, as if embarrassed by its own noise. The world emerged, glazed and new. They buried the boy's mother on a small rise where a cedar stood against the sky. The ground was half frozen. Elias broke it patiently with a mattock, while Clara kept Jonas close. The child held the strip of cloth he'd taken from his mother's skirt. When it was time, Clara knelt with him and tucked the cloth beneath the small wooden cross Elias had made. "Do you want to say anything?" she asked. Jonas frowned in thought, then said softly, "Thank you for making me. I'll be good." Elias's jaw clenched once, the way a door closes against a wind. He set his hat back on. "We'll come each spring," he said. "Plant something that blooms." "Names bloom," Clara murmured. "Some do," he agreed. When the storm broke in mid-December, sunlight returned weak but golden. Clara took Jonas outside for the first time. The boy laughed at the crunch of snow under his boots, chasing his breath like smoke. His laughter shattered the valley's hush, like a bell long buried. Elias leaned on the porch rail, pretending to study the fence but watching them instead, that small smile hiding in his beard. He had fashioned a second, sturdier latch for the door and a windbreak of slabs along the north wall. Protection had become his language for love. That night, Clara brought the warmth back into the kitchen. Jonas sat at the table while she kneaded bread, dusting flour across the air like a spell. Elias stirred stew over the fire. "You're learning domestic arts," she said. "Trying to keep up?" he answered. Jonas peered into the pot. "Smells good, mister." "Oid." "Then it'll taste better," Elias said, ruffling the boy's hair. The cabin filled with the sound of something simple and profound, 3 people breathing in rhythm. When Jonas grew drowsy, Clara wrapped him in a shawl and carried him to the small bed. Elias stood in the doorway a long moment afterward, as if committing the sight to a ledger only his heart could read. Snow kept a gentler pace the next days. A neighbor passed a stocky woman named Mrs. Mabry with a woolen shawl striped in cranberry and indigo. She lived 2 valleys over and traded eggs for salt and coffee. Word traveled without effort in a country that wide. "Heard tell you took in a boy," she said, stamping snow from her boots. "Lord bless your courage." Clara poured her coffee. "Bless the boys." Mrs. Mabry nodded, eyes soft. "Names matter," she said. "Give him one that holds." "Jonas." Elias answered from near the door. He didn't look up from the boot he was mending. "Jonas Mercer." Mrs. Mabry smiled into her cup. "Then the Lord make him steady as winter stars." Christmas Eve, 1879. The night came clear and hard, the sky an ocean of stars. They'd strung pine boughs across the mantel. Jonas insisted his little carved horse should stand above the hearth so Ma can see. Clara kissed his forehead. "She can, love." After he slept, they sat shoulder to shoulder, watching the fire's red heart slow. Coyotes sang to the moon in a key that sounded like memory. "He'll need a name," she said. "He's got one. I mean a family name. For school. For belonging." Elias stirred the coals until sparks leapt up like ideas. "You offering Mercer?" She nodded. "It's yours. Ours." He took a long breath. The word ours seemed to unlock a room behind his eyes. He reached for her hand. "Then he's Jonas Mercer. And whatever this place becomes, it's his too." Her throat tightened. "That's the first time you've said ours like it was easy. Maybe it finally is." Quote, "Snow fell through the night, soft, endless, forgiving." In the half-waking hour before dawn, Clara dreamed a winter field covered in letters instead of drifts. She walked it without sinking, each step lighting a word. Morning brought the world remade. The valley glittered under new snow, sunlight spilling like honey across the drifts. Inside, the smell of coffee and laughter mingled. Jonas chased the barn cat around the stove and then apologized to it solemnly, as if beginning a treaty. "You sleep well?" Elias asked. "I dreamed of names," Clara said. "Good ones, I hope." "Jonas, Clara, Elias," she counted. "That's enough to fill a prayer." He raised his cup. "To prayers that stick." They ate bread and stew and a small apple pie Clara had saved for the day. Afterward, Jonas took his horse down from the mantel and moved it along the windowsill, narrating journeys in a whisper. "Goin' to the cedar," he told the toy. "Then comin' back." Winter settled deep. Weeks passed in the quiet rhythm of survival and affection. Jonas learned letters from Clara's tattered primer. His small voice sounded out home and horse and hope. When he reached his own name on the page, she'd penciled Jonas in blocky capitals. He traced it with one careful finger and smiled so hard his cheeks turned to apples. Elias built him a sled from scrap lumber and a iron runner pried from a busted stove door. They spent afternoons on the hillside behind the cabin, the boys' laughter ricocheting off the frozen ridges. Each run ended with snow in their hair and in the cuffs of their sleeves, a wet joy they carried back to the fire. At night they told stories by the hearth, Jonas's wild inventions about buffalo kings and creek pirates, Clara's gentler tales about city clocks that forgot to tick, and Elias's careful memories from years he no longer feared. He spoke more now, not because he'd run out of quiet, but because he'd learned quiet could hold words without breaking. On a night of cruel cold, the wolves came near. Frost stars burned in the air, and their cries stitched the hills with an old song. Elias rose, lifted the rifle from its hooks, and stood by the window until the sound thinned. Clara sat beside Jonas, listening to both the wildness outside and the smaller, braver breathing within. "You don't sleep?" she whispered to Elias when the wolves had passed. "I listen," he said. "Me too." In the morning, they found paw prints near the corral, a circling argument the wolves had held with themselves about hunger. Elias firmed the fences and smudged lampblack on the window cracks. Inside, Clara stitched small sachets of sage and hung them above door and hearth. "Against bad dreams," she told Jonas, "and for good ones to find their way in." February came hard and gray. One afternoon a pale sun broke through, and Clara took Jonas up to the cedar. The snow lay deep and clean, each step a quiet decision. At the grave the boy knelt and pressed his mitten into the drift. "Ma," he said softly, then looked back at Clara. "Can you hear things with your heart?" "Yes," she said. "Then I can tell her I'm Jonas Mercer now," he said. And he did, with great seriousness, syllable by syllable, as if announcing himself to the sky. They left a small braid of pine needles at the cross. Jonas touched it once, and then took Clara's hand for the long walk home. On the ridge he asked, "Will you always keep me?" Clara squeezed his fingers. "Always," she said, and felt the word bind like good twine. In the evenings, Elias taught Jonas how to whittle. They began with soft pine shavings curled like butter around the boy's boots. "The knife is a promise," Elias told him. "It only does what you ask. Ask careful." Quote. Jonas nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir." He nicked his thumb once and did not cry. Elias wrapped it in a strip of cloth and said, "Now you've got the mark of a maker." Clara watched them, a quiet warmth flooding her throat. She set down her mending and rose to put on tea, because sometimes the right thing to do with a full heart is to give it something to carry. On a cold Sunday, Mrs. Mabry returned with a parcel. A tiny sweater knit in the kind of red that keeps tails from freezing. "For him," she said, tying it round Jonas's shoulders. "And this." She placed a small paper on the table, an old-school primer with a page of copywork. At the top, "Names are houses we carry." Clara read it aloud. Jonas listened, then whispered, almost to himself, "Then I will be careful where I live." A thaw teased and then fled. The river sang beneath its skin of ice, impatient to be itself again. Elias began to stack boards in the yard planks, planed and set to season for spring projects. A new coop, a porch bench facing east, a shelf high enough for the jars that had multiplied all winter with careful sweetness honey, preserved apples, a stubborn cluster of dill pickles that made Jonas wince and then grin every time he tested one. One twilight in February, the light fading violet over the snow, Clara stood at the porch rail watching Elias and the boy haul the sled uphill for just one more. The valley glowed with that pink stillness that comes right before evening decides to be night. For a moment, she felt something settle inside, a quiet recognition that she had come all the way through sorrow into grace. When they trudged back to the cabin, cheeks red, boots heavy, she met them at the door. "Elias, he answered, shaking snow from his hat. "You remember the letter I never sent?" "I do. I wrote another." He hung the sled on the wall. "What's it say?" "That I stayed," she said simply, "and that I finally have what I came west for." He smiled, the kind that begins in the eyes. "And what was that?" "Not a husband," she said, "a home that breathes." He crossed to her, took her hands, calloused meeting soft, and held them at his chest. "Then it's a good letter. You should send it." "I don't have to," she said. "The land already knows." That night, after Jonas fell asleep with the carved horse tucked under his chin, Clara pulled a small ledger from the shelf. She'd kept it since Boston, a book of debts and deliveries that had become, out here, a record of mercies. She wrote 3 lines. December 24. We spoke his name. January 4, he wrote it himself. February 19. We carried it to the cedar. She left space below, sure without knowing why that there would be more. Late winter brought illness to a neighboring homestead, a cough that dug deep. Elias saddled the roan and rode out with broth and a bottle of the willow tincture Mrs. Mabry swore by. He returned at dusk, cold through, eyes rimmed with a tired tenderness that made Clara's breath pull. "They'll do," he said. "The worst has turned." He washed his hands in hot water, steam fogging the glass. Jonas stood on a stool and handed his father a towel with great ceremony. "For the hero," he declared, and Elias laughed, the sound rare as a bright coin. On a Saturday, Clara tried on new boldness. "We should mark him proper," she said. "A naming. Here, by the fire." Elias nodded. "Tell me how." They made a small center on the table cedar sprigs, the little primer, the carved horse. Jonas stood between them in his red sweater, face bright and solemn. Clara laid a hand on his head. "You are Jonas Mercer," she said, "and you belong to this house and this land and to the love that keeps both." Elias cleared his throat, voice low. "You are my son," he said, "and I will build the world so it doesn't bite you first." Jonas grinned. "I will help," he said. "Good," Elias replied. "We've got miles to do." The river loosened another inch that night. When colder weather returned, the wolves kept their distance. Instead, owls took up the night's speech. Jonas named them in whispers Old Judge, Pale Sister, the one who knows. He and Elias crafted a small box for keepsakes. The silver button from Jonas's first winter coat, a feather found near the cedar, the strip of skirt cloth Clara had rescued from the snow, now washed and folded to the size of a prayer. On the lid, Elias carved a single word, Mercer. "Can we put the box on the high shelf?" Jonas asked, craning upward. Elias lifted him. "You'll be tall enough soon." "And I will," the boy said with devastating confidence. On the last day of February, a blue norther blew color into their faces and sent them scurrying early to bed. The fire banked low. The house breathed. Jonas slept between them on a pallet near the hearth, his hand flung open, palm pale in the glow. Clara watched the slow lift and fall of his chest and felt the strange, almost unbearable peace that sometimes came in winter, as if the world had agreed to be quiet at last. "Still hurts when it rains?" she whispered, tracing the old scar on Elias's arm. "Less now," he murmured. "Everything does." "That's what healing sounds like," she said. He turned his hand beneath the blanket until it found hers. "You cold?" "Not anymore." They lay listening, the slow breathing of a sleeping child, the steady crackle of the fire, and the wind curling tenderly around the eaves. Beyond the window the land slept under its white shroud, waiting for the names that would rise with spring. And when the first light touched the horizon, 3 sets of footprints led from the cabin door into the snowproof that what had been broken could hold weight again. In the pale of that morning, Clara stepped onto the porch and breathed the thaw beginning. Elias joined her with a cup. Jonas tumbled out, mittened and bright, and jumped from the top step into a drift that came up to his knees. "Where to?" Elias asked. "The cedar," Jonas answered. "Then home, always home." They followed him, and the valley held them the way good names do, without clenching, without judgment, simply true. By midday, the sun had enough muscle to turn eaves into strings of glass. Drips ticked a rhythm against the empty pail below the roofline. The sound pleased Jonas so much he matched it with his boots' step, tap, until he invented a dance that made Clara laugh. Elias pretended not to notice until he couldn't help it and tried a step himself. He was terrible at it, which made the boy bolder and the woman brighter and the house warmer. That night, Clara wrote another line in the ledger. March 1. We danced to the roof singing. She closed the book and set it beside the key.